In the first part of Aristotle's Ethics, we looked at his main theme of happiness, which was a translation of the word eudaimonia, which meant a flourishing. Now, part of his full definition of happiness included the idea of virtue. So happiness is an activity of the soul, but it is in conformity with virtue. And we didn't really talk about virtue, so that's the focus of this second part. Here's Aristotle's definition. So this is a quote. Excellence or virtue, the Greek word there is arete, is a state concerned with a choice involving a mean relative to us as determined by reason or as a man of practical wisdom would determine it. So there's our quote. What we need to do now is unpack this a little bit. So what is a state for Aristotle? He says virtue is a state. Well, a state, when we're talking about humans, think habits, think a routine way of responding in certain circumstances. So what do you do when you first get up in the morning, for example? Most people have habits, right? They do certain things. And so you would have a state of doing that in that circumstance. So virtues are habits. They are generally patterned ways of acting. Now, they are concerned with a choice, although some habits and some things that we do, it's almost as if we are on autopilot. We can choose to change those. So virtues and habits are developed through a process of decision, according to Aristotle, and they can be adjusted, according to Aristotle. These involve a mean that is relative to us. Now, does this mean Aristotle is a relativist? Certainly not. Absolutely not. So what does he mean by mean first, and then the phrase relative to us? Well, a mean, think arithmetic mean, first of all, it's a midpoint, and so we're going to explain that more thoroughly in just a moment. A midpoint between extremes of behavior. Now, this is going to be relative to us, relative to the individual, because, not because Aristotle's a relativist, but because we each have different resources and capacities to act in certain ways. So, for example, if we were taking the virtue of generosity, and we were to compare some of my students, most of my students, say a charitable organization, maybe to give $1 would be a generous activity. For me, at this stage of my career, giving $1 would not be that generous. For Bill Gates, giving $1 would be nonsensical almost. For him, $10 is less than a penny for most people. So that would not be generous. For some people, it would be generous for other people. And of course, it goes on the other side too. So if Bill Gates is going to give to a charitable organization, it's likely going to be millions of dollars. And certainly, I'm assuming most of you listening to this could not possibly do that. I know I could not possibly do that. Now, it's determined by reason, or as a man of practical wisdom, that is phronesis, would determine it. So we make these decisions to develop these habits in a certain way after we have thought them through, or as we think them through. And the Greek word phronesis there, it's a special kind of wisdom. So it's not the wisdom that we talk about when we talk about philosophy as the love of wisdom. That would be Sophia. This is a practical wisdom. This is the kind of wisdom in how you live your everyday life. What actions do you take? So that's what we're talking about here with phronesis. Okay, so we have habits, and excellent habits are aimed at a mean and the avoidance of excess and defect. So for generosity, again, you avoid giving too little, and you avoid the extreme of giving so much that you have nothing to live on yourself, right? So that's what Aristotle is saying is a habit that is aimed at a mean. So this is similar to health, and Aristotle would use this health and military strategy and these kinds of things as examples. And health involves the avoidance of excess and deficiency. So that includes exercise and eating and sleep, right? All of those things, you have to avoid the excess, not too much eating, not too much sleeping, not too much exercising, the latter fairly odd or rare, I should say. But you also have to avoid the deficiency. You can't starve yourself. You can't go without sleep, and you can't go without exercising if you want to be healthy. And so there has to be a midpoint with all of these activities in order to be healthy. Aristotle says it's very similar when we're talking about developing virtues. So what are some examples? What are we talking about when we're talking about virtues? Well, I mentioned generosity already. It's going to be a mean between prodigality, just throwing your money around, and being a miser, just refusing to give to any charitable organization or cause or individual in need. There's also temperance, or what we might today call self-control. It's a mean between indulgence and insensitivity. Now, on many of these virtues, humans, as by and large, have a tendency toward one direction or another. And with generosity, our tendency is to not give enough, right? So that most people have to work on moving in the other direction toward giving. With temperance or self-control, our tendency, especially in 21st century United States, is to overindulge in food and drink and those kinds of appetites. And so that's the tendency for most people, need to avoid that. But there is the other extreme that also needs to be avoided. For courage, it's going to have to be a mean between acting in rashness, doing something foolish, charging into trouble without thinking about it, or, of course, the other problem that most people have, the extreme that's most typically problematic, is being a coward, acting in cowardice. So all virtues are means between these extremes. Now, I've mostly focused on activity, but the emotions are also in balance. So, for example, with courage, you have to have the sense of fear and the sense of confidence in balance as well. So a courageous person not only acts in certain ways, but has balance in terms of his emotions. So here's what it looks like. We'll take the example of the virtue of courage. And at the top here, you see it's a balance in actions between being cowardly, not doing something that you ought to do in order to step up, work through the fear. But it's also a midpoint between acting rashly. And so on the emotional side, we have being too fearful on the left and being overconfident on the right. So what are we talking about? For Aristotle's time, an example might be, suppose you are a part of a military group of 10, and you are going out to advance scout an area. And suppose so now you're on your own, you're just out there scouting, and you see 10 of the enemies. Now, it would be rash, it would be overconfident to go and charge at those 10 on your own with your sword, right? You're going to get killed that way. So that's not courage, that's stupidity. Now, on the other side, if you were one of the 10 and some enemy scout came and decided he was going to take you all on, and so, of course, you should just take care of the situation and kill the scout. And if you're one of the 10 and you think, well, he does have a sword, he may get a swipe in, and so you kind of take a step back as your peers go ahead and take care of the situation, well, obviously that would be a cowardly action and the result typically of too much fear. So all virtues are like this. They are means between extremes in action and in emotions. So how do we maintain or even acquire these virtues or excellences? Well, we need to adjust according to our weaknesses. So this is very similar to getting a curl out of a poster, for example. You buy a poster, it arrives in the tube, it's all curled up, you take it out, you try to flatten it out, and it curls back up the way it was. Now you could try to flatten it with books or something heavy on a table or something flat, but that really doesn't always work. It still has that tendency to curl. So how do you get it out? Well, you need to curl it the other direction, right? If you take it out and you curl it the opposite way that it was rolled up, and then you can lay it down, that'll get the curls out. And the same way with us and our actions and emotions, we need to go a little past the middle in order to compensate. So we have to adjust according to our weaknesses. So what if you have a problem with generosity in that you are too miserly? It hurts you to give, and you just don't typically give to any charitable organizations whatsoever, but you reflect on this, you realize this is wrong, that you ought to be more generous. Well, initially, what you ought to do is give a little too much. That is more than you have calculated that you ought to. Give till it hurts, sometimes people say. Well, what do they mean? Push yourself, right? And as you do that, maybe you'll be more comfortable then when you fall back toward that middle area and develop the habit there. And that's how you become or maintain generosity. That's how you become generous or maintain it. So if you have a tendency toward overindulgence with food, something that is common, then you would need to eat less than what you need for a while. You get used to that sensation of hunger, get used to not having enough, and that will help you then get to the midpoint. If you lack confidence in speaking, for example, many people say that public speaking is extremely fearful to them, causes great anxiety for them. Well, start volunteering to be a leader, presenting a project or something where you have to speak up. Force yourself to do it. Go the extra mile to make sure that you are speaking in front of people, and you will get comfortable with it after a while, as I have done over my career. Okay, evaluation of Aristotle's ethics, big picture overall. What are some advantages? First of all, it's consistent with common sense. Aristotle is a realist. He's a pragmatist when it comes to these things. He talks about not only the things we just talked about with adjusting and maintaining and acquiring virtues. He also talks about something I didn't mention, but that is mentoring. If you find that you lack a virtue, the best thing to do is find someone with that virtue and spend time with them and act the way they do and ask them questions about why they do things a certain way. So that can be done with any of the virtues that you lack. You find somebody who is good with that virtue and follow it. And this is something that practically we've found that is very effective at developing skills. Another advantage is that unlike for Mill, for example, Mill's directive is to create happiness, again, pleasure and a lack of pain for Mill, unlike Aristotle's eudaimonia. But the idea is you do it for everyone. You just calculate how it's going to affect anyone and everyone. So you would not have an opportunity, according to Mill, really to value any given person more than any given other person. Well, Aristotle takes that into consideration, and he says it's okay to think that your friends and family are more important in terms of your activity. It's okay to be more generous with your friends, maybe in need, than with strangers. Aristotle says that's okay, that makes sense. And finally, it certainly allows duty. You can have some rules as long as they are not inviolable rules. It allows that to be taken into consideration. So as you develop habit, you may develop guidelines and rules for behavior in order to develop proper virtues. It allows you also to take into consideration consequences of your action in order as you think through how to develop virtues. This will inform what you should do. So it includes some of the things that we talked about with Kant's moral theory and with Mill's moral theory. Now, there are some problems. Not everyone is on board with Aristotle's ethics. For one, and this seems to be a problem that is difficult to respond to, and that is in challenging cases. How do you know what the mean is, right? It's all focused on aiming at the mean. That's what virtues are about, and happiness requires that you're living a virtuous life, so you have to know what the mean is. How do you tell? How can you tell what the mean is? Now, Aristotle does have an answer to that, but it is going to be a challenge in some circumstances. And another thing, we just mentioned choosing a role model. So if you lack courage, you need to find somebody who is courageous, and you spend time with them so that you too can develop their habits and become more courageous. Well, how do you know who's truly virtuous? Now, Aristotle, again, has an answer to both of these questions. It may not be a satisfactory answer. It's certainly not a satisfactory answer from some philosophers, but his response is, you have to be raised properly. You have to be in a good family and a good culture in order to be able to recognize what the mean is, to be able to recognize what the good model is for certain virtues. And so culture is very important for Aristotle. How you are raised, what you are taught in school, what your family tells you, these things are all really important for developing virtues. And so Aristotle takes a big picture and he says, you might respond, right? This might be the challenge. How can somebody then who's not fortunate enough to have a good upbringing or not fortunate enough to be in a positive culture, how can they become virtuous? And Aristotle's response is, well, it's going to be extremely hard for them, right? They may not really have much of an opportunity to become a virtuous person, to be happy, to become a moral person like Aristotle says one ought. And that's why he tied ethics to political theory so closely. You have to have the culture in the right situation in order to have individual people who are moral people. And of course, certain people can be very critical of that. You could see why that would be problematic for people who are not brought up in the right way, besides the whole question of what is being brought up in the right way. So those are challenges that we will not go into detail here. Unfortunately, I just wanted you to be aware of these challenges, the way that Aristotle responds, and then that there's still concerns about how he responds to those.